May 29, 1945. Dawn breaks over the ancient stone walls of Shuri Castle, casting long shadows across courtyards that have stood for 5 centuries. The air hangs thick with the smell of cordite and wet limestone. Rain falls in sheets, turning the cobblestones slick with mud and something darker. Through the mist, a sound emerges, low at first, then growing into a mechanical thunder that reverberates through the very foundations of Okinawa's spiritual heart. The grinding of steel tracks on stone. The rumble of diesel engines. American Sherman tanks, their olive-drab hulls streaked with red mud, roll through gates that were never designed to admit such machines. In the castle's underground command post, Lieutenant General Mitsuru Ushijima stands motionless, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword, listening to a sound that should have been impossible. The Americans were not supposed to be here. Not yet. Not like this. To understand the disbelief etched into every line of Ushijima's face that rain-soaked morning, one must first understand what Shuri Castle represented, not merely as a military stronghold, but as a symbol of Japanese resolve, of the island's unbreakable connection to the empire, of a defensive philosophy that had consumed 6 months of meticulous planning and the labor of thousands. Shuri was not simply the administrative center of the 32nd Army's defense of Okinawa. It was the keystone of a defensive system so elaborate, so deeply rooted in the island's volcanic rock and coral ridges, that Japanese commanders had convinced themselves it would take the Americans months to breach, if they could breach it at all. The castle sat atop a commanding ridge in southern Okinawa, its elevated position offering unobstructed views of the surrounding countryside for miles in every direction. Around it, Japanese engineers had carved out a subterranean fortress, a labyrinth of tunnels, bunkers, and concealed artillery positions that stretched for over 7 miles beneath the earth. This was the Shuri Line, the cornerstone of Japanese defensive doctrine, a killing ground designed to bleed the American advance white, to inflict such catastrophic casualties that the United States would reconsider its demand for unconditional surrender. General Ushijima had studied the American way of war. He knew of their material superiority, their seemingly endless reserves of ammunition and supplies, their preference for overwhelming firepower over tactical finesse. His staff had analyzed reports from Iwo Jima, from Saipan, from every island fortress the Americans had stormed across the Pacific. And from these reports, they had drawn what seemed an inescapable conclusion. The Americans could be stopped if Japanese forces refused to meet them on the beaches, refused to waste precious men in suicidal banzai charges. Instead, they would wait. They would burrow deep into the earth, turn every cave into a fortress, every ridge into a killing field. They would force the Americans to dig them out, yard by bloody yard. Time was the weapon. Attrition was the strategy. And Shuri was the anchor. The Japanese commanders expected the Americans to falter. They expected their tanks to bog down in the mud, their infantry to be decimated by interlocking fields of fire from positions they could neither see nor silence. They expected the ancient topography of Okinawa itself to become their ally, the narrow defile, the razor-edged coral ridges, the steep escarpments that channeled attacking forces into predetermined kill zones. They had turned the approaches to Shuri into a maze of death where American armor would be vulnerable, exposed, easily destroyed by the hidden 47mm anti-tank guns positioned in caves and spider holes. The Japanese truly believed, that Shuri Castle would stand as Iwo Jima's Mount Suribachi had not, that would become the tomb of American ambition in the Pacific. They were wrong about almost everything. The American assault on Okinawa had begun on April 1, 1945, Easter Sunday. Operation Iceberg, the largest amphibious invasion of the Pacific War, placed 183,000 American troops on the island's western beaches against almost no opposition. At first, the ease of the landings seemed to confirm Japanese expectations. This was the plan. Let them come ashore unopposed, let them push inland, then crush them against prepared defenses. But the Americans brought something the Japanese had not fully accounted for, something that reports and intelligence assessments had failed to adequately convey, not merely superior numbers or firepower, but an almost incomprehensible logistical capacity, an industrial might so vast it seemed to bend the rules of warfare itself. Within days of the initial landings, American engineers had transformed Okinawa's beaches into functioning ports. LSTs, landing ship tanks, beached themselves in endless succession, their bow doors yawning open to disgorge a flood of vehicles, artillery pieces, ammunition, food, fuel, construction equipment. Entire tank battalions rolled ashore. Self-propelled artillery. tank destroyers, armored bulldozers, and supplies, mountains of supplies that grew faster than Japanese spotters could count them. Cases of ammunition stacked in pyramids 20 feet high. Fuel dumps that stretched for acres. Field hospitals that sprang up overnight, complete with surgical tents and X-ray equipment. The Americans were not simply invading Okinawa, they were transplanting an entire industrial civilization onto its soil. Japanese observers, peering through field glasses from their concealed positions in the hills, watched this spectacle with growing unease. The scale was beyond anything they had anticipated. Imperial Japanese Army doctrine emphasized mobility, adaptability, fighting spirit, qualities born from necessity in a resource-constrained empire. Japanese soldiers were trained to endure hardship, to make do with minimal supplies, to see deprivation as a forge for warrior spirit. An IJA division on the march carried perhaps 2 weeks' worth of supplies. American divisions, by contrast, seemed to operate under no such constraints. They brought everything. Spare parts for vehicles, replacement barrels for machine guns, fresh fruit, ice cream, gasoline in quantities that seemed wasteful, profligate. A Sherman tank consumed gallons of fuel per mile, yet the Americans never seemed concerned about running dry. They simply brought more fuel. This was the first crack in Japanese confidence, though few would admit it yet. The assumption had been that American material superiority, while formidable, would be constrained by the same logistical realities that governed all military operations. Surely, the Japanese reasoned, the Americans would outrun their supply lines. Surely their advance would slow as they pushed deeper into Okinawa's interior, as the distance from the beaches grew and the terrain became more difficult. Surely their tanks would run out of fuel, their artillery would exhaust its ammunition, their infantry would tire, and hunger would dull their combat effectiveness. None of this happened. By mid-April, American forces had reached the outer defenses of the Shuri line. Here, finally, the Japanese sprang their trap. From concealed positions in the Kakazu Ridge, from Hacksaw Ridge, from countless coral caves and fortified tombs, Japanese artillery and mortars opened fire. The Americans advancing across open ground were caught in a storm of steel. Companies were pinned down for hours, sometimes days. Tank after tank was knocked out by well-aimed anti-tank fire from positions that revealed themselves only when they fired, then disappeared back into the earth. The advance slowed to a crawl measured in yards per day. American casualties mounted. This, the Japanese told themselves, was the attrition they had planned for. This was where American will would break. But American will did not break. Instead, the Americans adapted with a speed and flexibility that Japanese commanders found bewildering. When infantry assaults stalled, the Americans brought up flame tanks, Shermans modified with flamethrowers that could project streams of burning napalm 100 yards into cave mouths. When Japanese positions proved too well concealed for conventional artillery to suppress, the Americans employed something the defenders had never encountered, coordinated naval gunfire on a scale that defied comprehension. Battleships offshore, their 16-inch guns capable of hurling a shell weighing as much as a small car over 20 miles, walked barges across Japanese positions with metronomic precision. The earth itself seemed to heave and split under the bombardment. Caves that had taken months to excavate collapsed in seconds, burying their defenders alive. Still the Japanese held. Then came the tanks, not in ones or twos, easily isolated and destroyed, but in massed formations supported by infantry, engineers, and artillery in a combined arms ballet that the Japanese had no doctrinal answer for. American tank platoons would approach a Japanese strongpoint, halt at a safe distance, and methodically reduce it with high-explosive shells and machine gun fire while infantry worked around the flanks. When anti-tank guns revealed their positions by firing, American artillery would saturate the area within minutes. The Japanese had prepared for American attacks. They had not prepared for American patience for this grinding, methodical, industrial approach to warfare that seemed to have unlimited time and resources. And through it all, the rain came. Okinawa's spring rains turned the battlefield into a quagmire. Roads dissolved into rivers of mud. Foxholes filled with water. The dead, impossible to bury in the rocky soil, lay where they fell, decomposing in the heat and wet. Japanese commanders, watching from Shuri Castle, allowed themselves a grim satisfaction. Surely now the American advance would bog down literally as well as figuratively. Surely their vaunted tanks would sink to their axles in the mud, become immobilized, vulnerable. The ancient roads leading to Shuri, narrow paths designed for foot traffic and ox carts, would never support the weight of American armor. This assumption, like so many others, proved tragically wrong. American engineering units, moving with a speed that seemed impossible, laid corduroy roads across the mud, logs placed side by side to create a stable surface. When logs were scarce, they laid pierced steel planking, interlocking metal sheets that could support the weight of a Sherman tank even in soupy mud. They built bridges overnight. They bulldozed new roads where old ones proved inadequate, their armored dozers, Shermans with their turrets removed and bulldozer blades fitted, carving paths through terrain the Japanese had deemed impassable for armor. The tanks kept coming. Through rain, through mud, through artillery fire, they kept coming. And behind them came supply trucks, endless convoys of GMC 2.5-ton trucks known as deuce-and-a-halfs, each one carrying ammunition, rations, fuel, water, medical supplies, mail from home. The American advance was not just an army, it was a mobile industrial economy. Inside Shuri Castle's command bunker, deep beneath layers of stone and earth, General Ushijima and his chief of staff, Lieutenant General Isamu Cho, studied maps by lamplight and received increasingly dire reports from field commanders. The Kakazu Ridge had fallen. The Maeda Escarpment, Hacksaw Ridge, as the Americans called it, had been taken after days of savage fighting. Each defensive line, prepared with such care, held for a time, then crumbled under the weight of American firepower and persistence. Japanese casualties were heavy, but this had been expected. What had not been expected was the Americans' apparent indifference to their own casualties. Each time a position was overrun, staff officers reported the same bewildering observation. The Americans evacuated their wounded within hours, sometimes minutes. Medical corpsmen followed close behind the advancing infantry, stabilizing casualties on the spot. Jeeps equipped as ambulances ferried the wounded back to aid stations. From aid stations, they were moved to field hospitals. From field hospitals, the seriously wounded were evacuated by ship to rear area hospitals in the Marianas or even Hawaii. The speed and efficiency of this medical evacuation system meant that many Americans who would have died on a Japanese-held battlefield survived. And it meant that American units could sustain casualties that would have shattered a Japanese formation and still maintain combat effectiveness. The Japanese had no equivalent system. Wounded soldiers who could not walk were often left behind, given a grenade or a handful of rice, and told to hold their position until death. Medical supplies were scarce. Blood transfusions, routine in American aid stations, were virtually unknown in Japanese positions. Morphine was reserved for officers. Common soldiers were expected to endure pain with stoic silence, to view suffering as a test of character. This disparity in medical care was not merely humanitarian, it was operational. American units could sustain higher casualties and recover more quickly because their wounded returned to duty. Japanese units, once bloodied, grew progressively weaker, each casualty a permanent loss. By mid-May, the outer defenses of Shuri had been breached. American forces were now fighting in the suburbs of what had once been Okinawa's capital, in the villages that clung to the slopes below the castle. Here, the fighting took on a character of particular savagery. Every tomb, and Okinawan culture had built elaborate family tombs into the hillsides, had been turned into a fortified position. Every house concealed a machine gun nest or a sniper. Japanese soldiers, knowing there would be no retreat, fought with desperate ferocity. Americans, exhausted after weeks of continuous combat, fought with a grim determination born of the knowledge that each strongpoint reduced was one less obstacle between them and the end of this terrible campaign. Flame tanks moved through narrow streets, reducing stone buildings to infernos. Artillery fire collapsed structures onto their defenders. The ancient capital of the Ryukyu Kingdom was being methodically destroyed. And still the tanks came. This was the detail that haunted Japanese commanders in those final days, the sheer relentlessness of American armor. The Sherman tank, which the Japanese had initially dismissed as inferior to their own Type 97 Chiha medium tanks, proved devastatingly effective in the close-quarters combat around Shuri. The Sherman's 75mm gun could demolish stone walls and bunkers with high-explosive rounds. Its machine guns, 1.50 caliber on the turret, 2.30 caliber machine guns in the hull and coaxial mount, could sweep Japanese positions with withering fire. More importantly, there seemed to be an inexhaustible supply of them. When a Sherman was knocked out, and many were, another appeared to take its place. Sometimes within hours. The Americans had brought over 800 tanks to Okinawa. They had brought spare parts, replacement engines, entire maintenance battalions dedicated to keeping armor operational. A Sherman that through a track in the morning could be repaired and back in action by afternoon. This was beyond Japanese comprehension. IJA tank units, once their vehicles were destroyed, ceased to exist as effective formations. The Japanese had brought perhaps 50 tanks to Okinawa. By May, virtually all had been destroyed or abandoned for lack of fuel. The symbolic weight of this disparity was not lost on Japanese officers. The tank represented something more than military hardware. It represented industrial capacity, technological sophistication, a societal ability to produce complex machinery in quantities sufficient to waste it. Every Sherman rumbling through Shuri's outskirts was a rolling refutation of Japanese propaganda about American decadence and weakness. These were not the soft jazz-listening, consumer-obsessed weaklings that Japanese media had portrayed. These were soldiers backed by an industrial leviathan that could afford to ship ice cream factories to forward bases, that could build tank landing ships faster than submarines could sink them, that could replace every loss, and then expand production further. On May 27th, General Ushijima made the decision to abandon Shuri Castle. The position had become untenable. American forces were now fighting in the castle's outer courtyards. Artillery fire had reduced many of the ancient buildings to rubble. The underground command post, once thought impregnable, shook with each impact of naval shells. More critically, American forces had begun to flank Shuri, pushing around both sides of the position in a double envelopment that threatened to cut off the entire 32nd Army. If they waited longer, they would be trapped and annihilated. Better to withdraw to the island's southern tip, to Mabuni, and continue the resistance there. The decision was militarily sound but psychologically devastating. Shuri was not supposed to fall. Certainly not in less than 2 months. The evacuation began under cover of darkness and rain. Thousands of Japanese soldiers filed through the tunnels, emerging at exits on the southern slopes, then melting into the countryside in small groups. They took what supplies they could carry, destroyed what they couldn't, and abandoned the rest. The Americans, unaware that the evacuation was underway, continued their assault. And on the morning of May 29th, elements of the 1st Marine Division and the 77th Infantry Division converged on the castle from multiple directions. They expected fierce resistance, a final climactic battle for the symbolic heart of Okinawa. Instead, they found the castle largely abandoned. Small groups of Japanese rear guards fought delaying actions, then retreated or died at their posts. And then came the moment that defined the campaign's bitter conclusion. American tanks rolled through Shuri Castle's gates. The site was profound in its historical symbolism. These narrow gates, designed in the 15th century when Okinawa was an independent kingdom, had admitted diplomats, tribute missions, royal processions. They had been built to human scale, to the dimensions of men on foot or horseback, perhaps pulling carts. They had certainly never been designed to accommodate a Sherman tank weighing 33 tons and measuring nearly 20 feet long. Yet through them the tanks came, their tracks grinding against stones that had been laid before Columbus reached the Americas. The juxtaposition of ancient and modern, of East and West, of feudal architecture and industrial warfare was almost too perfectly symbolic to be real. Yet it was real. Photographers captured it. Combat cameramen filmed it. And somewhere in the tunnels beneath the castle, Japanese officers who had not yet evacuated heard the grinding of tank treads above their heads and understood that an era had ended. Lieutenant General Ushijima, by then safely withdrawn to the southern positions at Mabuni, received the report with stoic acceptance. He had known, intellectually, that Shuri would fall. But knowing a thing and experiencing its reality are different. The image of American tanks, those brutal symbols of industrial supremacy, rolling through the sacred precincts of the castle, represented something more than military defeat. It represented the confirmation of a truth that Japanese military doctrine had struggled to deny throughout the Pacific War, that spirit, however fierce, could not overcome material reality, that courage, however genuine, could not substitute for resources, that the willingness to die, however sincere, could not defeat an enemy who possessed both the will to win and the means to achieve it. What the Japanese commanders could not believe was not merely that American tanks had reached Shuri, though the speed of the advance was shocking, but that those tanks were supported by a logistical system so robust it seemed to operate according to different physical laws than the ones that constrained Japanese forces. American tank crews, when their vehicles were hit, often survived thanks to superior armor design and could return to duty in replacement tanks. Japanese anti-tank gun crews, once they revealed their positions by firing, were obliterated by return fire and could not be replaced because there were no reserves. American tanks that broke down were repaired or replaced. Japanese defensive positions, once overrun, stayed overrun because there was no capacity for counterattack. The Americans fought with a casualness born of abundance. They could afford to waste ammunition suppressing a position that might not even be occupied. They could afford to call in naval gunfire worth tens of thousands of dollars to destroy a single bunker. They could afford to replace losses, to rotate exhausted units out of the line for rest, to provide hot meals and mail delivery even to troops in combat zones. This abundance, more than any tactical innovation, was what Japanese commanders truly could not believe, not in the sense that they doubted its existence, but in the sense that they could not emotionally process the implications. The Sherman tank became, in Japanese consciousness, the symbol of this abundance. It was not an elegant machine. It was not superior to German panzers in armor or firepower. But it existed in such quantities, was so reliably supplied with fuel and ammunition, was so efficiently maintained and replaced when lost, that its individual shortcomings were irrelevant. The Sherman was industrial war incarnate, mass-produced, standardized, good enough rather than perfect, and available in quantities that made quality secondary. Japanese commanders, those who survived to witness the occupation, would spend years trying to understand what had happened. Some, like Ushijima, chose death over the humiliation of surrender. Others lived to write memoirs filled with analyses of tactical mistakes, operational blunders, strategic miscalculations. But the most honest among them acknowledged that tactics and operations were secondary, that the war had been lost before it began because Japan had chosen to challenge a power whose productive capacity made defeat inevitable. The Americans did not win because they were better soldiers. Japanese troops, man for man, were at least as brave and often more tactically proficient. The Americans won because they could afford to lose 10 tanks and bring up 20 more, could afford to sustain casualties that would have destroyed a Japanese division and replace them within weeks, could afford to fire 10 shells where the Japanese fired one, could afford to waste resources on a scale that to Japanese observers seemed almost sacrilegious. This was the lesson of Shuri, the bitter truth that Japanese commanders could not believe even as they witnessed it, that abundance is itself a form of strength, that a society wealthy enough to provide its soldiers with hot meals and mail delivery in combat zones is a society that cannot be defeated through attrition. The Japanese strategy had been to make the cost of victory unbearable, to kill so many Americans that the United States would accept a negotiated peace rather than pay the full price of conquest. But this strategy assumed that Americans valued their soldiers' lives more than they valued victory, that there was some calculable price at which American resolve would break. It was a reasonable assumption. It was also completely wrong. The Americans, it turned out, were willing to pay virtually any price to achieve unconditional surrender. Not because individual American soldiers were more willing to die than Japanese soldiers, they emphatically were not, but because American industrial capacity meant that the price could be paid primarily in material rather than lives. Every shell fired, every bomb dropped, every tank destroyed, and replaced was America choosing to spend resources rather than soldiers. And because American resources were effectively limitless in the context of the Pacific War, the strategy of attrition could never work. Japan could kill Americans. It could inflict terrible casualties. But it could not kill Americans faster than American industry could produce the weapons and supplies necessary to continue the campaign. The tanks at Shuri represented this calculus made visible. Each Sherman that rolled through the castle gates embodied tens of thousands of man-hours of American industrial labor, thousands of tons of steel and rubber and copper, gallons of fuel refined from oil drilled in Texas or California or Oklahoma. But America could afford these costs. America was, in 1945, producing approximately half of the world's total industrial output. American factories were churning out a new aircraft every 5 minutes, a new ship every day. The Manhattan Project, developing atomic weapons, employed over 130,000 people and cost $2 billion, more than the entire Japanese military budget for 1945. This was abundance on a scale that Japanese planners, working within the constraints of an island economy blockaded and bombed, could not match or counter. The war ended 3 months after Shuri fell, concluded by atomic fire, rather than the invasion of Japan's home islands that both sides expected. But the principle demonstrated at Shuri, that American industrial supremacy made Japanese defeat inevitable, was the same principle that made the atomic bombs possible. The bombs were not a deviation from the logic of industrial warfare, they were its ultimate expression. a single weapon, delivered by a single aircraft, achieving what would have required thousands of conventional bombers and tens of thousands of shells. Efficiency through superior technology, backed by the industrial capacity to develop that technology and produce it in quantities sufficient to employ it strategically. In the ruins of Shuri Castle, now quiet except for the sounds of American engineers beginning the work of reconstruction, the ground itself bore witness to what had transpired. Tank tracks scarred the ancient stones. Shell craters pockmarked the courtyards. Buildings that had survived centuries of typhoons and political upheaval lay in ruins, victims of a 3-month bombardment that expended more explosives than had been used in entire wars of previous centuries. The Japanese had defended Shuri with courage and skill, had made the Americans pay in blood for every yard of ground. But courage and skill, in the end, had proven insufficient against an opponent who could bring to bear not merely superior numbers, but a fundamental economic superiority that made every tactical victory hollow. The Americans rebuilt Shuri Castle in the decades after the war, restored its gates and walls and ceremonial buildings as a gesture of respect for Okinawan culture and a symbol of reconciliation. But the restoration could not undo the historical reality of that rainy morning in May 1945 when American tanks first rolled through its gates. That moment, shocking to Japanese commanders, celebrated by American troops, tragic for Okinawan civilians caught between the two armies, marked the end of one epoch and the beginning of another. Japan's attempt to forge an Asian empire through military conquest had been defeated not by superior strategy or tactical brilliance, but by the grinding, relentless application of industrial power. And so the last truth of Shuri, the truth that Japanese commanders could not believe even as they lived it, that in industrial war, abundance is destiny. The side that can afford to waste wins. The side that must conserve loses. The Americans could afford to fire 10,000 shells to destroy a single bunker. They could afford to lose 100 tanks taking a single ridge. They could afford to feed their soldiers steak and ice cream, could afford to evacuate their wounded by air, could afford to pause their advance to bring up more supplies rather than pushing forward undersupplied. These affordances collectively constituted an insurmountable advantage. Not because any single American soldier was more valuable than his Japanese counterpart, but because the system that supplied and supported that soldier was so vastly superior that individual valor became almost irrelevant to the war's outcome. The rain fell on Shuri that May morning, and the tanks rolled through, and an era ended. Not merely the battle for Okinawa, not merely the Pacific War, but something larger. The illusion that spiritual strength could overcome material reality, that willpower could substitute for resources, that courage could defeat chemistry and physics and industrial production. The modern world had announced itself in the worst possible way, through violence and destruction, but it had announced itself nonetheless. And in the tank tracks ground into Shuri's ancient stones, one could read, if one looked carefully, the shape of the future, a world where wars would be won not by the bravest, but by the most productive, where industrial capacity would matter more than individual heroism, where abundance would be the ultimate weapon and scarcity the fatal weakness. The Japanese commanders at Shuri learned this lesson in the hardest way possible. The rest of the world learned it by watching.